Okay, so this is going to be the final pre-recorded lecture in Biology 3804, and the topic of this lecture is culture in animals. And I have a couple of quick videos to start with. This first one is kind of like an abstract one, and it's about 1 minute long. And this video is showing a drawing of a single line that was then replicated by 500 strangers on the internet. And these people were paid a couple of cents to copy that line. And they copied it in a chain. So each of the copiers was then their line was copied by someone else in turn. And so that's the process that you're seeing illustrated in this video. And what you see is that small errors by these copiers accumulate over time, and we end up with something very different than the starting material. And they even start to diverge into multiple lines at this point. And so the idea here is that much like in genetic evolution, imperfect copying and mutation is a source of genetic evolutionary change. Imperfect copying can also be a source of socially transmitted behavioral change, and that's the topic culture. Here's another example. When I was a kid, we called this the broken telephone game. And in this game, this fellow demonstrates, I think it's like motorcycle riding or something, and the people in this transmission chain copy each other, and the behavior changes more and more as we get to the end, and you'll see how different it ends up. So you're going to see in this lecture how cultural evolution can be either adaptive or not adaptive or sometimes neutral. And it's interesting to think about. Imagine if he had started two chains with this motorcycle riding behavior. These two different chains that maybe set off into different rooms might have ended up in completely different behavioral places. So cultural evolution can be a source of divergence, of diversity between populations. Okay, so this is our final pre-recorded lecture. These are the topics we're going to cover. What is culture? We'll look at some examples of culture in cetaceans. We'll look at how culture spreads. We'll look at some videos of chimpanzees. We'll briefly talk about applications of culture in conservation, and then we'll talk about cultural evolution, kind of bringing it all together. Just as some reminders, this Friday, March 25, I'm recording this video on Thursday, so that's tomorrow, we have a group discussion on the paper by Sasaki and Biro on collective navigation and homing pigeons. Next Wednesday, during our scheduled class time at 8:35 a.m., we have some guest speakers that are going to be presenting on Zoom, short research talks. And if you attend this and the presentation sessions the following week, and if you fill out all the forms, you can earn a bonus on your overall course grade. And the guest speaker material may be covered on the final exam. And I'm going to record that in case you can't make it at that time. I'll record it and post the recording afterward as well. On Friday, April 1, that's next Friday, we have our final paper, our final group discussion assignment on a paper on innovation in parrots. Okay, so what is culture? In humans, culture refers to persistent geographical differences in language, food, dress, social norms, behaviors, music, dance, art, architecture, religion, etc. And these are traditions that are transmitted through social learning, imitation, copying, and teaching. Even within English-speaking countries, we have regional differences in language. If you go to Newfoundland or Saskatchewan, people will say different things than the way people speak in many places in Ontario. And there's lots of Canadianisms, like chocolate bar. Like, I guess they don't use that in the United States. Talking about elastics or pop. Americans have different words for those things. There's a really neat quiz from almost 10 years ago now, where you can learn about kind of regional differences in everyday words in the United States. And if you fill out this quiz, you can find out where your vocabulary fits in, like what region of the United States are you closest to. But my point is that culture is a consequence of social learning in humans. And memes are actually cultural evolution. The word meme was coined by a biologist, Richard Dawkins, in his book, The Selfish Gene. And he came up with this word to combine the idea of cultural imitation with the sound of the word gene. And he used meme because it sounded like gene, and because there's a Greek word for imitation, Mimema. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I should be able to pronounce it right because my mother is Greek. But so he came out, he coined the word meme for a unit of cultural transmission. It's an idea that gets transmitted. And he emphasized that the idea of this replicator, this thing that gets replicated, genes and memes are replicators. And the physical bodies of the organisms are just the vehicles by which replicators spread. So this is a really powerful framework. So for example, a beaver's body is just the vehicle for the beaver's genes, right? It's a beaver's body is how beaver's genes make more of themselves. And it's also how the meme of the beaver dam makes more of itself. So if we assume that dams are something that beavers learn how to do and aren't encoded fully in their genes, the dam can be considered a meme that gets transmitted from one beaver to the next. Now, the use of the terminology meme for humor on the internet came decades later, but the idea of memes, the idea of like jokes that get socially transmitted is hundreds or thousands of years old. And this is interesting to me. The V-sign meme started in the 1500s. Okay. Do animals have culture too? Well, they have social learning. And they have regional differences between populations in behaviors that arise through social learning. And people who have been watching animals have known this for a long time. Going back to ancient Greece, Aristotle described animals using copying, and he described that these processes could add to an animal's behavioral repertoire. And Darwin, in 1871, in his book on sexual selection, describes social learning. He said, apes are as much given to imitation that animals learn by experience and imitate each other's caution. In the time since, many researchers in animal behavior have come up with definitions of culture in animals. And this table, the text is probably too small for you to read very easily, so I don't want you to learn all of these definitions, but my point is there have been many definitions by animal behaviorists for how we should define culture. And this is like 14, the whole table had 14 different definitions, I think. And this was a paper on culture in whales. For our course, we're going to use the definitions on this slide. We'll define culture as information or behavior that's shared among individuals within a community and that gets acquired from conspecifics, that means the same species, through social learning. In the paper we're going to read this week on the homing pigeons by Sasaki and Biro, culture gets defined as population-specific behaviors, so that's like something that's shared within a community and is different from other communities. It's acquired via social learning, and it's acquired from knowledgeable individuals. Okay, so in the next couple slides, we're going to see some videos of evidence that cetaceans, whales, have foraging cultures. So let's take a look, and I hope that there won't be any copyright issues with this clip. I think this one's about 2 minutes long.
But more impressive than the humpback's size is their intelligence and the sophisticated way they work together. The hunt begins as the whales dive beneath a school of herring, emitting high-pitched calls. In a panic, the fish flee to the surface, where the whales concentrate them by releasing columns of air bubbles. The bubbles act as a barrier. The fish will not swim through it. The whales coordinate their efforts, so the bubbles surround the herring. Finally, the pod leader emits a sound that cues all the whales to ascend with mouths open. A humpback can eat a ton of herring a day this way. Incredibly, each whale ascends in the same position, in the same pattern, time after time.
Okay, that foraging behavior is so fascinating. And the incredible thing is that different whale populations within a given species can often have different complex, coordinated foraging tactics. So, is this culture? I want to highlight that there's a second link at the bottom of the slide where you can see how dolphins have the same kind of sophisticated, coordinated social foraging techniques, and that often differ between populations as well. Okay, so here's a little explainer about how researchers study this behavior. I could not find the link to this video. I couldn't find it on YouTube anymore. I think I'm going to play about 2 minutes of this video. So let's take a look at how researchers study these kind of underwater foraging techniques.
If you're a whale biologist, like this guy, Dave Wiley of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, this is your day at the office.
Good placement. Wait till she brings her back up. You're right on the right spot. Let her bring it up. Let her bring it back up. Let her bring the back up now. Perfect. Perfect.
That was a humpback whale off the coast of Massachusetts. And the thing the biologists are sticking on its back?
We're sticking on their backs this really amazing piece of technology that's called the D-tag. It's small, it's held on by 4 suction cups, and it'll stay on for about 20 hours.
All the while collecting data.
It collects pitch, roll, and heading at about 50 times a second. It also has hydrophones embedded in it.
So it records the position of the whale in the water and the sounds around it. And all that data can be combined and translated into 3D visualizations like this one.
We can now see what the animals are doing underwater.
And one thing Wiley really wanted to see in particular was how humpbacks hunt fish using bubbles.
A bubble net is this neat device that humpback whales have invented where they expel bubbles to encircle a school of fish.
Like sand lance, for example.
The fish see that bubble wall as a barrier and they won't pass through it.
The humpback swims through the center of the net, mouth agape, all the way to the surface, and then...
Wow.
This is the ultimate big gulp, on the order of...
A carload of water at one time. It's a very spectacular scene. So I've always wanted to know what the heck was going on down below.
And that's what the tags and visualization software created by collaborator Colin Ware of the University of New Hampshire reveal. And that's what Wiley and colleagues published this week in the journal Behavior. This is a recreation of 2 tagged humpbacks in Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary. The tag showed that when it comes to making bubble nets,
There's really 2 different styles. One, which was this upward spiral style.
so this motion becomes this at the surface. And the fish are trapped in here.
The other style that we found, which hadn't ever been described before, was this double loop feeding.
The bubbles get blown during that lower loop. In fact, you can hear it.
Yeah, that kind of faint trickle. Kind of I like that.
Then it comes to the surface for a tail slap before chowing down.
That little tail slap is something that's intriguing and still a mystery to us.
Many mysteries remain, like how whales learn the different bubble netting techniques,
We only had one whale that did both behaviors.
how multiple whales raid each other's nets or work together.
What are they doing down below together?
These are questions Wiley couldn't even seriously consider answering before these tags.
I've been watching humpback.
Okay, so I'll pause the video there. So as the video was explaining, it revealed that the humpback whales in the study had 2 different strategies of bubble netting. They had the regular style of releasing the bubbles while swimming in upward spirals, and then they had this other double loop style represented on the right-hand side of the slide, where they corral the prey, then do a tail smack and possibly disorient the prey, and then do a second upward loop and capture the trapped prey at the end. So it's very complex behavior, and it's like they're using tools, but the tools are their bodies. But the question is, are these really socially learned cultural differences, if we find differences between whale populations, or could there be alternative explanations? Well, we can think about what are the other possible processes that could explain behavioral differences between populations within a given species like humpback whales. One possibility is that there are genetic differences between the populations that determine these behaviors. Another possibility is that there are differences in the non-social environment that shape these behaviors. For example, you could imagine the availability of some resource is different, and that resource is determining the behavior, and it's really not that the differences are socially learned. They're just a response to that non-social environment. If you moved whales from one population into the other, they would use the other behavior because they'd be in the other environment. So to demonstrate that something is culture, we have to rule out these possibilities. Okay, so if we look at whale bubble net foraging, what we find is that foraging techniques are shared within a community and are different when you look at different communities, and we have data that they spread rapidly. So this is data from a study in the Gulf of Maine off the coast of the US, where I don't actually, let's see, is it humpback whales again? I'm not sure actually. I think it is. But what happened was there was this special lobtail technique that included an extra tail slam on top of the water midway through the bubble netting. And we kind of saw a representation of that a few slides ago. So I think this is humpback whales again. So this lobtail behavior was first noticed in 1981 by whale biologists who were tracking the population for many years. And they hadn't seen it before. It first appeared in 1981. Only a few whales did it then. But by 1989, almost all of the whales in the population were using it. So this graph is showing the spread of this behavior within less than a decade. And so that's too fast to have been determined genetically. These whales are very long-lived animals, sometimes living for a century. So it's far too fast for something to spread, for genetic change to occur over just 10 years. Okay, so that summarizes that point. Okay, so looking at other cetaceans like dolphins, there are many examples of foraging techniques that differ between populations. And so another one is sponge-based foraging in bottlenose dolphins. So in Shark Bay, Australia, bottlenose dolphins break marine sponges off the seafloor and wear them on their snouts while they're foraging among the coral. And it's like a glove that protects their sensitive rostrum from kind of sharp pieces on the coral. And a lot of sponges are flat. In fact, most sponges are flat, but the dolphins select the sponges that have this nice conical shape that stay on their rostrums really well. So it's all very sophisticated behavior. So is it genetic or cultural? Well, researchers analyzed the DNA of spongers and non-sponger dolphins from the same part of the ocean, same environment. So they could kind of determine which dolphins were using sponging and which ones weren't, and they looked at their genetic sequences. And they found that overall spongers were no different genetically from non-spongers. So it's not as though it seems to be a genetic inheritance of this ability. And they also found that spongers tended to be related to each other through their mitochondrial DNA, through their maternal line. And so that suggests that there's probably transmission of sponging behavior from mother to offspring. And so that brings up our next topic. How does culture spread? Well, there are three different mechanisms laid out on this slide, and they're all kind of easy to imagine. But vertical transmission is what we saw in those dolphins. It's where transmission occurs from one generation to the next. So parents to offspring, or grandparents to grand offspring. Those are examples of vertical transmission, and it's almost always the elders to the youngers. Horizontal transmission is transmission of social information within a generation of approximately same-aged individuals, like adult to adult or juvenile to juvenile. Oblique transmission is when transmission crosses generations of unrelated individuals. So juveniles transmitting behaviors to other juveniles that are not their kin. Okay, so I want to cover a nice example from birds. And this study looked at birds that are related to the chickadees we have here. These are the European versions of great tits, they're called. And so they were studied in forests in England, and the birds in those forests have been tracked for many years. And the researchers have a nice system where they've tagged all of the animals and where they can train them to use these puzzle boxes. And these puzzle boxes are just a simple bird feeder, but to access the food, the birds know that there's food in there, they kind of recognize the box, but to access the food, the birds need to know that they have to slide this handle to open the box. And so this like colored piece that you see in the middle behind the bird has to be either slid to the left or to the right to open the box. And so it's tricky for the birds to figure that out on their own. It's very rare for them to figure that out. But what the researchers did in this study was they wanted to see how easily does cultural information spread and how long does it stick around. And so they captured a couple of birds from each flock living in this forest, and they trained them in captivity. And so they kind of did, like the humans did the demonstrations there, so that the captured individuals learned, okay, the box gets opened by sliding to the left, or some of the individuals would be trained to know, okay, the box gets opened by sliding to the right. Now, in reality, the box can be opened either way, but they captured a couple of birds from each flock and trained them one way or the other. Then what they did was they released those trained individuals back into the forest. They rejoined their home flock, and the researchers put out puzzle boxes like the ones that the birds had been trained on in the wild to see what would happen. What would the trained birds access the food, and then what would happen with the other birds in their flock who were observing what they did. And this is what they found over time. This is a time series of their results. So they had flocks shown in red, that in those flocks, the captured birds had been trained to slide the door to the right. The blue data were flocks where the captured birds had been trained to do the opposite, slide the door to the left. And the green flocks were the control flocks, where 2 individuals had been captured, but they had not been trained to open the box at all. Okay, and so what happened was that over a span of just a couple of weeks, within these flocks, the other birds quickly, the flocks that had the trained individuals seeding this behavior, the other individuals in their flocks quickly learned how to do it within, 2 or 3 weeks. In the control flocks, some birds started to figure out how to open the puzzle boxes as well, but you can see it's a significantly slower process. So training these kind of seed individuals really did kickstart that ability in the population. So this is an example of horizontal transmission demonstrated experimentally. Now here's the really neat part. They followed these birds using these puzzle boxes for months. They tracked them for an entire year. And when they went back and looked at these flocks a year later, the remarkable thing is that the flocks that had been trained to open to the left a year later were still opening the door to the left. And the flocks that had the seated individual had been trained to open the door to the right, they were still opening the door to the right a year later. So it's a remarkable case of an arbitrary strategy, right? Because that box could be opened either way. This arbitrary strategy of like leaning left or leaning right persisting for quite a long time in these flocks. Okay, moving to another example, coming back to whales. A lot of birds, actually, and whales and other animal species have another type of culture, which is vocal cultures. And dialects are one example of that. So dialects are communication styles that are shared among members of a community or members of a population that differ between communities or differ between populations, and that get transmitted by social learning. And it's very analogous to accents in humans or slang or different dialects of French, for example, depending on whether you're learning French in Quebec or learning French in France or in the Caribbean. Okay, so sperm whales have been studied quite a lot, and their dialects are quite well described. They make these patterns of clicks called codas, which are thought to function in grouping with individuals that they know and identifying their close kin, for example. And researchers have mapped out how different populations in different parts of the Pacific Ocean use different codas. And they've labeled the kind of these dialects as clans. And the remarkable thing is that these clans, these sperm whales are not like, they don't have limited home ranges, right? They're moving over thousands of kilometers as they're foraging, moving throughout the ocean. And they're all members of the same species using the same environment within the Pacific Ocean. and yet they interact preferentially with same dialect individuals. And so this tells us that dialects aren't just a result of the non-social environment, because they're all using the same part of the ocean, and they're really overlapping with each other in space. Because they I went too fast there. Because they interact preferentially with same dialect individuals, it has potential evolutionary consequences, because if you stick with those who are like you over time, that can produce reproductive isolation and perhaps even the origin of new species. Okay, so I want to look at an example of complex cultural traditions in chimpanzees. And this is a classic study that really kickstarted a lot of work on culture in animals. And actually, it brought together a whole bunch of different long-term studies of several different chimpanzee populations across Africa. So this study that was published in 1999 brought together 151 kind of researcher years of observations. And they very carefully quantified 39 different behavioral variants that differed among these chimpanzee communities, including things like the types of tools the chimpanzees used, the ways they groomed each other, what they did to communicate, how they courted each other. And they were common in there's behaviors that are common in one chimpanzee population, but not in the others, without any clear environmental reason. And so what the researchers argued was this is an example of a rich, kind of multifaceted culture, just like humans have. And so this is one of the figures in their paper, actually. So this slide and the next slide kind of show the upper and lower parts of this figure. And so these are 3 of the 7 chimpanzee populations, and the little cells throughout the diagram here represent the different behavioral variants. And if a cell is colored in, if there's like a colored image, it's like that population has that behavior. If it's this kind of grayish empty circle, it does not. Okay, and then here's 3 more of the populations that they studied. And so I just want to highlight, rain dancing is a really interesting chimpanzee behavior. These 3 populations happen to exhibit it. But termite fishing with sticks is only exhibited by the Gombe population of these 3. And using a stone anvil as a way to crack open nuts and things like that, that's only exhibited by the Thai forest population. So there's these numerous differences between these populations. Okay, and then this is a really nice field experiment that followed on the heels of that earlier study. And in this experiment, they looked at 2 different Ugandan communities, that 2 of the kind of chimpanzee populations that were previously studied. And they gave the chimpanzees in these 2 different populations an identical task. They put out these logs where holes had been drilled into the logs, and the researchers filled the holes with honey. And the chimpanzees love honey, so the idea is that the chimpanzees are going to want to extract the honey from those logs. Okay. So they had these 2 populations. They had the Kibale chimpanzees and the Budongo chimpanzees, which are referred to as Sonso on this figure, I think, or in part of this study. Okay, so the Kibale chimpanzees every day use sticks in their culture to acquire honey. And what they did when they were presented with these logs in the experiment, was they manufactured stick tools to extract the honey. The Sonso chimpanzees, which have no food-related stick use, but have leaf technology, what they did was they fashioned scoops out of leaves to access the honey that was deeper than their fingers could get. So it shows that these wild chimpanzees rely on their existing cultural knowledge to solve this novel task that the experimenters created for them. Okay, so I'm going to show you another video example, and the link at the bottom of the slide will take you to that if YouTube makes me trim it out. And I think this is a really remarkable example of behavior. We don't actually know if this is culturally transmitted. It could be genetically determined, but it's interesting to think about how this is like the origin of a lot of human behaviors. So let's take a look.
Their favourite poison is found crawling in the forest. Like pufferfish, millipedes are toxic. But that doesn't stop the lemurs seeking them out. The millipedes use dangerous secretions, including cyanide, as a defense. But the lemurs still chew on them, albeit extremely cautiously. The toxins cause the lemurs to salivate. They then rub both the saliva and the millipede into their fur. They use it as an insecticide to ward off insects such as mosquitoes that carry malaria. But they are suspiciously enthusiastic about the whole process. It seems they don't just work as an insect repellent. The chemicals also appear to send them into a trance-like state. A condition of complete intoxication. Seem to get enough. When it's all over, there's no hiding the state they are in. Time to sleep it off.
Okay, so as I mentioned before, we don't actually know if that behavior, that use of these toxic arthropods is culturally transmitted or not, although I would hypothesize that it probably is. But what I like about it is to think about the potential consequences. There could be adaptive benefits to this behavior of warding off serious parasites like malarial vectors that can carry malaria, for example. But there could also be proximate consequences like a pleasurable effect, and that these proximate consequences might help this behavior spread. Of course, they could also have ultimate costs of getting intoxicated and maybe being less vigilant if there are predators around. Okay, so moving on to a different idea here. Animal culture has applications for us as well. And the idea that I want to highlight in this brief slide is that cultures might matter for wildlife conservation. And this is a title and some points from a very nice essay that came out a couple of years ago, arguing that when we want to preserve evolutionarily distinct populations, because that's the idea, we want to preserve evolutionary diversity. That's kind of the stuff that nature needs to be able to continue to adapt to new change. We need to know about culture, right? Because cultural divergence can be an indication of distinct populations that are willing to breed with each other, for example. Animal cultures also matter when we want to be able to reintroduce captive bred animals into the wild. So, for example, in elephants, the matriarchs are disproportionately important to elephant groups. Because they're repositories of important knowledge that gets socially transmitted vertically from the elders to the young. And so it's if we're like putting a lot of resources into captive breeding animals, we need to make sure that they become like integrated culturally into the new group that we release them into, right, in order for things to succeed. And we, as conservationists, we may need to find ways to restore cultural knowledge that's been lost due to human interference. One example is whooping cranes that nearly went extinct in the past, and people began to captive breed them, and now populations are starting to recover. But before the captive bred cranes could successfully perform their traditional migration, the migration that they had evolved to do over millions of years, people actually needed to train them to do it in a little airplane. And without that kind of seeding of the cultural knowledge in the population again, they wouldn't be able to succeed. And another example that comes from Canada is our bighorn sheep populations in Alberta. Bighorn sheep are managed carefully because they're like prize animals for hunting, and kind of command a lot of money for like tags to be able to hunt, like permits to be able to hunt these animals. And sometimes animals need to be removed from one area and brought into a preserved area so that, you know, an important individual in the population won't be hunted. But translocating an animal from somewhere where it does know the environment to somewhere where it doesn't can mean that they lose that information about the environment that might be kind of built up over generations of cultural transmission. Okay, so lots of reasons why culture matters. Okay, so this is kind of the last big section of this lecture. And I want to now think more about evolutionary ideas. And so let's come back to this idea that in genetic evolution, the way genetic change happens is that mutations accumulate over time, right? So by mutations explore new possibilities, and most of them are not good effects, and so most of them get like kind of weeded out of the population, but occasionally a mutation is beneficial, and then that's how adaptation happens. But there's also lots of neutral mutations that don't affect fitness positively or negatively, and they can increase or decrease in frequency just by chance, and that process is called genetic drift. Well, a similar thing can go on in social learning, and we saw this at the beginning. Small errors in the process of copying can accumulate to become bigger and bigger changes over time, and that's what I mean by cultural evolution. And so we can also think of how culturally transmitted behavior, culturally transmitted variations can be shaped by both neutral and adaptive processes. And much like genetic evolution, cultural evolution can lead to phenotypic differences that can then produce reproductive isolation. Like if two bird populations are separated by a new mountain and they end up singing different songs over millions of years of neutral cultural evolution, and when they come back together, they don't recognize each other as potential mates anymore, for example. So that last point means that cultural evolution and genetic evolution can interact, because if culture, if arbitrary cultural behaviors produce reproductive isolation, that is then influencing the process of speciation and the process of genetic evolution as well. So this is this idea of this gene-culture coevolution framework, which is pretty mind-blowing. But we can think of it as genes shape the proximate mechanisms of learning, which can themselves evolve and change. Social learning allows cultural phenotypes to evolve and change. And culture can produce adaptive or arbitrary differences between populations. Culture can also change the selective landscape that a species is subject to. For example, when humans evolved new ways of keeping ourselves warm, or like using fire, that opens up the opportunity for us to expand into new environments or to use new resources that weren't available to us before. So tool use, complex cultural strategies can change the selective landscape. And cultural differences can promote reproductive isolation between populations. So it's the idea that these three processes are all like interwoven and influencing each other in multiple ways. Okay, this is a quick example that I find really fascinating, and it touches on a topic that is covered in the paper on the homing pigeons that we're going to read this week for group assignment number 7. And that topic is called cumulative cultural evolution. It's hard to wrap your mouth around. So the study I want to tell you about was actually a simulation study. It was like a theoretical study modeling how this cumulative cultural evolution process may have occurred in like ancient human societies. And so there's like imaginary societies, and they were modeling kind of a theoretical process of developing new medicines. And so this little map here showed how they were modeling two populations, one imaginary population that lived inland, shown on the left, and then one imaginary coastal population shown on the right. And each of the populations was made up of several different camps that are shown by the different colors here. And so the people within the camps could exchange information, like new things that they figured out how to do. And also there was more limited exchange of ideas between the camps. Okay, so what is cumulative cultural evolution? Well, cumulative culture is the ability to build on the cultural behaviors of one's predecessors such that the products of culture progress beyond what any one individual could invent alone. And so this is like the hallmark of what makes us humans able to do so many things, right? Like the computer that I'm recording this lecture on, it relied on the kind of cumulative ideas of so many people, right? Like, I don't know, hundreds of people throughout history that came up with a bunch of different concepts that go into this one technology that gives me the power to do this. And no one person could have done that on their own. Okay, so in the study, they modeled this process of cumulative improvement. And so they had this kind of imaginary set of plants in the environment. And there was, if you'd combine the plants in just the right way, you could produce different medicinal products. And if you combine the different medicinal products in just the right way, you'd get like a really effective medicinal product. And so they kind of modeled this idea that there were different recipes that would produce things of increasing medicinal value. And the question was, how quickly would these imaginary human societies hit on the most effective medicine? Like how long would it take for them to evolve the most effective medicine through their simulated cumulative cultural evolution? Okay, and so they simulated different social group sizes, they simulated different copying rules and different levels of exchange and trade between the different camps. And their general conclusions were that larger social groups, like more people in the group, means that you can discover new things faster. That's not entirely surprising. Like more people are kind of exploring more possibilities faster. But what they found that was surprising was that too much copying actually slowed innovation. And they found that the simulated societies that attained crossover, that attained the most powerful medicine first, that occurred when individuals mainly copied their close social partners with kind of periodic sharing between the camps. But if everybody was too good at copying each other, what happened was they would kind of get stuck in these less effective medicine stages, and they wouldn't necessarily make it to the final crossover recipe. So their conclusion, which is a really interesting one, and who knows if it works in this model, but who knows if it's true. But their conclusion is that cumulative cultural evolution might be facilitated by close-knit ties within groups and weaker ties between groups. Okay, so one of the last topics I want to talk about is what about the possibility that culturally transmitted behaviors could be maladaptive, that they could have negative consequences. Well, in principle, this is possible. For example, social learning could result in the transmission of outdated information or misinformation. And this was demonstrated in a really nice study of guppies that I'm going to show you on the next couple of slides. Okay, so in this study, it's a bit hard to explain, but researchers studied guppies in the lab, and I've tried to illustrate the experimental apparatus at the bottom of the slide, but they had a tank where the guppies were placed on one side of this tank initially, and there was this partition in the middle, and on the other side of the partition there was like a food resource shown in blue, and there were two different routes to get to the feeder. There were openings in the partition that guppies could have gone through. They could have gone through like the left side or the right side, but the feeder was much closer to one of the openings than the other. So what that meant was that there was a short path and a long path. Okay, and what the researchers did was they would initially train some founder fish to take either the short path or the long path. And they could do that by just like blocking off the other path. And so kind of forcing the founder fish to learn a particular route to the food. And then they would create a new social group with some founders that had a certain behavior trained, and they would create this transmission chain by gradually changing up the individuals in that group. Okay, so it's the same kind of experiment that we're going to read about these homing pigeons. Okay, so they would create 4 founders, they would add 1 observer into the group, and they would gradually swap out those founders one by one until the little school was now a school of like fish that had all learned the behavior socially. They'd learned which route to take by observing and following other fish. Okay, and so what they found was that, first of all, the fish generally preferred the route that the founders had been trained on. So we've got 2 different time series on this first graph on the left, and the x-axis here is like as the days of the experiment progressed. So they had the guppies like going through these routes over and over again. And as time went on, or plotting is the proportion of fish in these experimental groups that were still taking the same route as their founder. And what you find is that it's generally pretty high, right? Especially the first day, it's almost 100%, it's almost at 1. And as time goes on, we can see that in the group of the squares, those are the fish where the founders in the group had been trained on the short route. They almost all of them continued to use the short route for the whole week after the experiment began. In contrast, the fish in the group where the founders had been trained on the long route, initially were mostly all taking the long route as well, but it started to decline. So they learned the maladaptive behavior, the behavior that took more energy and time, but it started to be lost as time went on. Okay, and then on the other side of the slide, I'm trying to remember what this graph is showing. So what they looked at was that the difference between fish in this experiment that tended to join up with other individuals versus fish that tended to stay more solitary. And it was interesting. And so this is like focusing in on the groups where the founders had been trained on the long route. So the founders had the maladaptive strategy. And what happened was they showed that the more sociable observers were less likely to figure out the better route, right? It was the solitary fish that were able to, find the better route, kind of using their own personal learning, whereas the more sociable fish in these routes seeded with a maladaptive founder, the more sociable fish tended to use the long route for longer, more days into the experiment. Okay, so sometimes social learning can allow maladaptive traditions to persist. But of course, they can also be lost, right? And over time, the first graph was showing how these long route trips were gradually lost. And the classic example of that in real life is that of these blue tits that learned how to open milk bottles in England. Milk bottles are not so much delivered in this way anymore. I don't know if that changed during the pandemic, but most people now get their milk at the grocery store. And apparently milk bottle opening is also on the wane. So the prevalence of this behavior is getting rarer and rarer. Okay, so that's all of the main lecture content for this lecture. And I just want to wrap up by telling you about a place I visited in France way back when I was a student. In the Pyrenees Mountains, there's a system of caves called the Neo Caves. And if you go there, you can visit cave sites that were used by people 15,000 years ago. And you walk on a 2-kilometer cave path. So you walk 2 kilometers deep into the cave. And what's the amazing thing that blows my mind is that the 2-kilometer route is the one that was added more recently. The prehistoric people that used these caves actually walked 5 kilometers through to get to the kind of caverns at the end where you get to see something very special. So prehistoric people traveled 5 kilometers into these tunnels, and you get guided by a guide, and you each get a lantern and you follow them in. And you see things like these painted symbols that people made thousands of years ago and footprints from thousands of years ago. And then you get to the special chamber at the end, and the guide makes you all turn off your lamps, and they turn on their really special lamp that's only allowed to be in here. And they reveal these amazing line drawings of animals all over the walls of this cavern that were drawn 15,000 years ago. And it's incredible to think people crawled 5 kilometers deep into this cave before they had flashlights, before they had lanterns to make this amazing art. What made them do that? It's a really interesting cultural phenomenon. Most of the paintings in this particular cave are bison, although bison were not actually common in this part, like in these mountains at that time. And so the point I wanted to make is just that people have always been observing animals. Animal behavior has been an important part of human knowledge and human culture for a very long time. Okay, so I hope that you've enjoyed the lectures in this course. And I just wanted to remind you again about our paper discussion Friday, our guest speakers on Wednesday, March 30, and then another paper discussion on Friday, April 1. And the week after that, we'll have student presentations in our 2 scheduled lecture times, and I'll email you with more details about that. Okay, I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.